In 1912, the U.S. half-heartedly began tinkering with the idea of building battle cruisers. Heavy on the cruiser, light on the battle. At the height of World War I, 1916, the decision was made to actually build them. Like the Colorado class, though, construction was delayed since the priority was building merchant ships and the destroyers to escort them. In 1920, work finally started. 2 years later, in 1922, under the terms of the Washington Treaty, all were canceled, to the relief of many. But they weren't done for yet. Under the treaty, 2 capital ships were allowed to be completed or converted to carriers. The 2 that were furthest along were chosen, so work continued on them. After a long conversion, these were completed as the 2 ships of the 36,000-ton Lexington Class in late 1927. From a design point of view, being large conversions, and early ones at that, the hangar and flight deck were built as integral parts of the hull. The flight deck was the strength deck. This led to a fully enclosed hangar. Unlike most carriers in World War II, the bow was completely enclosed all the way up to the flight deck, a feature of the hangar being part of the hull. This also prevented taking water over the bow and helped strengthen the ends of the flight deck at the cost of end-on AA fire. The island and funnel were mounted roughly midship on the starboard side. This set the pattern for future carriers and was mostly due to pilots' tendencies to veer left when landing. The funnel was massive. This was mostly due to the sheer number of boilers needed to get these ships up to their desired speed. It also had the effect of getting exhaust up and out of the way of planes that were landing. On the downside, its massive weight required permanent ballast be carried on the port side to avoid listing to starboard. As with their predecessor and contemporary battleships, they used turbo-electric propulsion. Because of some doubt as to the value of aircraft when they were built, especially at night, they also carried a relatively heavy battery of 8 8-inch guns when completed. This may sound ridiculous in retrospect, but it was a symptom of the times when carrier aircraft hadn't reached its potential yet. Planes were still fabric covered. Their range, speed, and payload capacity was limited. Also, night operations were virtually out of the question. In fact, during their first few exercises, both got sunk, repeatedly. You have to remember that at the time, given there weren't many carriers and that their aircraft were of dubious value, the carriers were seen as primarily scouts and spotters for the battle fleet. They were cruisers that could scout extra far due to their planes. Hence the designation of CV, cruiser heavier than air aircraft. Attack was a secondary role. In fact, at first carriers were even meant to act as support ships for the battle fleet's float planes, hence the large cranes for recovering them and the catapults to launch them. So they were chained to the battle fleet, usually scouting ahead of it, and they got sunk a lot in doing so, either by each other or by scouting enemy cruisers. The later, sunk by enemy cruisers, explains the 8-inch guns. The former, sunk by each other, explains why carriers usually operated independently of each other. It was viewed as best not to put all the proverbial eggs in one basket. It also partly explains why carriers had relatively few fighters, that is to say, interceptors. There was no point in having a lot of fighters for interception if you didn't know the enemy's planes were coming. Instead, search and attack was seen as the best defense. Find the other guy and get him before he finds you. Of course, radar, having a lot more carriers available, the quality gap, and the intelligence gap eventually arguably evened out the odds for a carrier essentially chained to an objective, whether that object was the battle fleet or the island its fleet was assaulting. Given these limitations at the time, it didn't sound so crazy. Armor was mostly carried over from the battle cruiser origin and was similar in concept, if not scale, to contemporary battleships. When completed near the end of 1927, these were easily the best carriers anywhere in the world. They were faster and carried more aircraft than their foreign counterparts. Over the next 10 years, they would continue to show the evolving value of carriers, not just for scouting, but also for sea control and power projection onto land. A good way to tell them apart is that between the wars, they sported stripes on their funnels. Lexington's was horizontal, while Saratoga's was vertical. Additionally, Saratoga had a walkway on the outside face of her funnel. Still, by the start of the war, they were overloaded and were due for modernization. To that end, near the end of 1941, they were scheduled for yard work that would bulge them to not only increase torpedo defense, but to help restore lost buoyancy and the need to carry permanent ballast on the port side. Also, the 8-inch guns were to be removed in favor of more anti-aircraft guns. Saratoga was in the process of this work and Lexington preparing for it when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. Despite this work, by even mid-war, Saratoga was obviously losing credibility as a frontline carrier. She was quickly getting mechanically worn out. Her turning radius was huge. Her fuel consumption was astronomical. Her elevators were small and awkwardly placed, effectively making her a one-elevator carrier. Also, despite her great size, being a conversion meant she couldn't operate as many planes as newer purpose-built ships. Lexington was started January 8, 1921, and finished December 14, 1927. Saratoga was started September 25, 1920, and finished November 16, 1927. Main armament was 8 8-inch 55 caliber guns in 4 twin turrets, 2 forward and 2 aft of the island structure. Secondary armament was 12 5-inch 25 caliber anti-aircraft guns in single open mounts, 3 being fitted near each corner of the ship. Propulsion was turbo-electric. 16 boilers provided steam to 4 turbines. These in turn produced electricity which powered 8 motors, 2 attached to each of the 4 propellers. These produced 180,000 horsepower for a top speed of 33 knots. 1 massive rudder turned them. Side armor was 5 inches at the bottom, increasing to 7 inches at the top, sloping outward 11 degrees as it thickened. This spanned the middle of the ship and ran the length that would have been between turrets 1 and 4. The end of the armor was created by bulkheads up to 7 inches thick forward and aft. The main armored deck was the deck under the hangar floor and was 2 layers that were a combined 2 inches thick. The TDS was 5 layers thick, with layers 2, 3, and 4 usually liquid-filled. The engine room was heavily subdivided owing to the turbo-electric propulsion. Each boiler, each turbine, and each pair of motors was in its own compartment. The turbine compartments were end-to-end down the middle, with 8 boilers running along each side. The flight deck was 866 feet long by 106 feet at its widest point. A single flywheel catapult was initially fitted. 2 elevators were fitted in the flight deck midship. The front one was just between the bridge and the second 8-inch gun. It was 29¼ feet by 59¼ feet, but a 26 by 20 foot section of the flight deck behind it could open up to allow longer aircraft to pass through. The rear one, which was just between the rear end of the funnel and the third 8-inch gun, was 29 feet by 34¾ feet. The hangar was 393 feet long by 68 feet by 20 feet high, taking up 2 decks, and ran from the forward elevator aft to about the end of the rear 5-inch guns, and was virtually totally enclosed. Behind it was 108 feet of workshops on 2 decks devoted to things like fuselage, wing, and torpedo repair, along with welding, engine testing, and such. Underneath the hangar was stowage 128 feet long for aircraft parts. Even entire planes could be stored disassembled. Aircraft complement was originally 90, though with aircraft getting larger through the years, by World War II, this would be down to about 70, usually about 24 fighters, 36 dive bombers, and 15 torpedo planes. Modifications before the war were light. In 1934, both had their catapult removed. In 1936, Lexington had her flight deck widened near the bow and lengthened to 888 feet. Both had minor work, mostly to increase light anti-aircraft. Starting in late 1941 and completing after her torpedoing in January of 1942, Saratoga was modernized. At Pearl Harbor, right after the first torpedoing, her 8-inch guns were removed. Continuing on to the west coast, the damage was permanently repaired and her hull was bulged to increase the depth of her TDS, restore lost buoyancy, and eliminate the need to carry ballast on the port side. This also increased fuel capacity. The flight deck was widened at the bow and lengthened to 888 feet. The island was cut down, losing the tripod and gaining a pole mast. All of the 5-inch 25 caliber guns were removed. 16 5-inch 38 caliber dual-purpose guns were fitted. 8 guns were in 4 twin turrets, replacing the 8-inch mounts. The remaining 8 were in single open mounts paired at the 4 corners, taking the place of the 5-inch 25s. 2 Mark 37 directors were also fitted, one on top of the island and one at the rear of the funnel. In late March to early April of 1942, while undergoing refit at Pearl Harbor, Lexington had her 8-inch guns removed. The intention had been to also remove her 5-inch 25s and replace both types with 5-inch 38s as in Saratoga, but she was too badly needed in service, so the 5-inch 25s remained. She was sunk at the Coral Sea before any more work could be done. Other wartime modifications to Saratoga included the usual increase in radar, along with light and medium anti-aircraft. In mid-1943, her bow arresting gear was removed. In mid-1944, she was fitted with 2 bow catapults. While repairing damage suffered off Iwo Jima in 1945, her small rear elevator was consigned to history, and her forward one was replaced by a new 44 by 44 foot one. Final displacement rose to well over 45,000 tons. Lexington was ferrying Marine fighters to Midway on December 7, 1941. After fruitlessly searching for the Japanese force, she headed south and began searching for any invasion force that might be headed to Hawaii or Midway from the Marshalls. In the middle of the month, she took part in the aborted plan to reinforce Wake. For the first 2 weeks of 1942, she patrolled the waters around Hawaii in case the Japanese returned to Hawaii or moved toward Midway or Samoa. In late January of 1942, she set sail for the Coral Sea, intent on stopping or at least harassing Japanese advances there or toward Samoa. In mid-March, after joining with the carrier Yorktown, their combined aircraft flew over the Owen Stanley Mountains and attacked Japanese forces at Lae and Salomeu. She arrived back at Pearl Harbor near the end of March for overhaul that lasted till mid-April. Back in the Coral Sea with Yorktown at the start of May, the two took part in the Battle of the Coral Sea. Having helped sink the light carrier Shoho the previous day, on May 8th her aircraft put 1 bomb into the large Shokaku. In return, Lexington was hit by 3 bombs and 2 torpedoes. Within an hour and a half, damage control had corrected the 7-degree list, putting out most of the fires and had her back up to 25 knots. It was a remarkable example of damage control, but it was short-lived. Spreading gas vapor soon exploded, dooming the ship. After abandoning her, the burned-out hulk was scuttled by 2 torpedoes from the destroyer Phelps. Saratoga was at the west coast getting her modernization on December 7th. She quickly loaded spare Marine fighter planes, gathered some escorts, and headed for Wake, stopping at Pearl Harbor to refuel. Hearing that Japanese forces had landed, the relief mission was called off, and she returned to Hawaii near the end of the month. While patrolling south of Hawaii on January 11, 1942, she was hit by a submarine torpedo that did light damage. After putting into Pearl Harbor for temporary repairs, she proceeded to the west coast for permanent repairs and to complete her modernization. When these were completed near the end of May, she quickly loaded her air group plus reinforcements and headed west to join in the Battle of Midway, but arrived at Pearl Harbor on the 6th and joined the carriers on the 10th. Next, she covered the invasion of Guadalcanal and took part in the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, sinking the light carrier Ryujo. She continued to support the fighting on Guadalcanal until August 25, 1942, when she was hit by another submarine torpedo, temporarily knocking out power, which eventually sent her back to Hawaii for repairs. Returning to the South Pacific at the start of December 1942, she covered the rest of the Guadalcanal campaign and the drive up the Solomons, being joined by the British carrier Victorious, aka USS Robin, in mid-1943. In early November of 1943, she and the light carrier Princeton raided first Buka and then Rabaul, where they destroyed many Japanese aircraft and damaged ships in port before joining in the invasion of the Gilberts till the end of the month. At the start of December of 1943, she headed to the west coast and overhaul that lasted the rest of the year. Rejoining the fleet in mid-January of 1944, she covered the invasion of the Marshall Islands until the end of February. She then headed west, and near the end of March 1944, joined the British Pacific Fleet, which was forming up at Sri Lanka, essentially becoming a training carrier. For 2 months, she helped the British work out the details of carrier fleet operations in the vast Pacific by helping them launch raids throughout the East Indies before leaving for the West Coast at the end of May. Emerging from overhaul in late September 1944, she began training night fighters at Pearl Harbor for the rest of 1944 and January of 1945. At the start of February of 1945, owing to the kamikaze threat, she rejoined the fleet to operate with Enterprise as a night carrier for the invasion of Iwo Jima. On February 21, 1945, she was hit 6 times by bombs in airstrikes that wrecked her forward flight deck and sent her back to the West Coast for repairs. With repairs complete in late May, she spent the rest of the war training pilots at Hawaii. Post-war, she was relocated to the Bikini bomb tests where she was sunk during Test Baker.